días a todas y todos. Iniciativas y proyectos que promueven la justicia, la participación, la transparencia y la rendición de cuentas gubernamental. Hoy nos unimos al Centro para una Nueva Economía, quien con el apoyo nuestro de la Fundación Miranda y la Fundación Francisco Carvajal han hecho posible este evento. Austeridad, deuda y crecimiento, hay otro camino. De este modo, contribuimos a democratizar el conocimiento y ampliar el alcance de esta conferencia, asegurando la diversidad entre el público que se ha dado cita aquí y los que nos ven por livestream. La participación de todos los puertorriqueños es cada vez más importante para que las decisiones que se tomen tengan como prioridad los mejores intereses de nuestro pueblo. Espacios Abiertos aboga por la transparencia en los procesos que se llevan a cabo para reestructurar la deuda pública, modificar el presupuesto y restablecer el crecimiento económico del país. La opacidad nos ha salido cara y todos debemos incidir, participar, fiscalizar y exigir un enfoque que responda a nuestras necesidades y respete los derechos humanos. El mensaje del profesor Stiglitz nos ayudará a fortalecer nuestros reclamos. Ahora les presento al presidente y fundador del Centro para una Nueva Economía, Miguel A. Sotoclás, quien junto a su equipo de trabajo es responsable de que hoy el profesor Stiglitz se haya incorporado a la iniciativa que el CNE está liderando para restablecer el crecimiento económico en Puerto Rico. Mike fundó el Centro para una Nueva Economía en 1998 y desde entonces el CNE es una de las voces más creíbles e influyentes en Puerto Rico. Desde el año 2014, el CNE ha sido reconocido como uno de los top think tanks según el informe Global Think Tanks de la Universidad de Pensilvania. Dejo con ustedes a Mike Sotoclás, quien junto a un grupo de emprendedores tuvo la visión de fundar un think tank en Puerto Rico, dedicado a restablecer el crecimiento económico y quien, a pesar de los grandes retos que enfrentamos, persevera y nos recuerda siempre que Puerto Rico es una gran causa. Gracias.
Muy buenos días. Qué bonito se ven esta sala llena. Es un privilegio para mí y para el Centro para una Nueva Economía tenerlos con nosotros en esta mañana. Yo no sabré mucho, mis hijas me lo recuerdan a diario, pero sé que cuando vas a presentar a un conferenciante del prestigio y reconocimiento global de Joseph Stiglitz, lo mejor que puedes hacer es hablar lo menos posible y darle paso al maestro. Y así lo haré. Pero no quiero perder la oportunidad para hacerles un llamado y una exhortación muy breve en los próximos 4 minutos. Puerto Rico se encuentra en un momento crítico. Aunque no lo podamos entender bien o siquiera describirlo, todos lo percibimos. Hay algo amenazante y preocupante en el aire y en el ambiente. Por eso fue que este evento se llenó tan rápido. Los registros para el local original llegaron a su cupo en menos de 2 horas. Y aún este auditorio de casi 1.500 asientos al fin y al cabo se nos quedó pequeño. Y varios miles más nos están viendo por internet. El llamado que te hago es el siguiente. Si en algún momento de tu vida tuviste la inquietud o el deseo de tomar acción, este es el momento de hacerlo. Todos tenemos que informarnos, movilizarnos y organizarnos. Fueron muchas las situaciones que provocaron que llegáramos a esta terrible encrucijada en la que se encuentra Puerto Rico. Pero en mi opinión, la principal causante fue que muchos de nosotros nunca hicimos nada para evitarlo. Y ya no tenemos el lujo de volver a cometer ese error. No sé si se han dado cuenta, pero ya muchos otros intereses se han organizado y movilizado. ¿Cuándo has visto al jefe de un subcomité congresional abogar abiertamente y sin pudor a favor de un acuerdo para bonistas particulares? Si no te habías enterado, es hora de que te informes y te actives. Esto es asunto de todos. Una de las consecuencias más perniciosas de la Junta de Control Fiscal, y lo que en realidad a mí más me preocupa, es su potencial para adormecernos como comunidad y como pueblo. Nos mal acostumbra a que vengan otros de afuera, ajenos a nuestros valores, a decidir por nosotros y tomar las acciones que nosotros debemos tomar. Puerto Rico necesita un ejército y los exhorto a que se sumen a este movimiento de ciudadanos que puedan pensar críticamente y que exijan más transparencia, más evidencia y auditoría y más rendición de cuentas. Que permanezcas en vigilancia continua y permanente en defensa de tus intereses y tus derechos como ciudadano y como puertorriqueño. ¿Quién puede pensar que el gobierno de Puerto Rico no debe ajustar su cinturón y ser más eficiente, responsable y austero? Pues seguro que sí, que lo debe ser. Pero me preocupa ver que la austeridad se está utilizando como subterfugio para el saqueo de las riquezas de nuestro país. Con la excusa de que tenemos que reducir los gastos públicos, se busca justificar las ventas de activos del gobierno, los desarrollos en terrenos de alto valor ecológico y el desmantelamiento de nuestras más importantes instituciones, siendo la principal de ellas la Universidad de Puerto Rico. La austeridad es un arma de dos filos que no discrimina. Empieza por los más débiles y vulnerables y de esa manera duerme a los demás. Pero con el tiempo la austeridad termina carcomiendo la prosperidad de todos, con el agravante de que para cuando te das cuenta ya es muy tarde. Este evento de hoy es parte del plan de trabajo y las actividades inaugurales de la Comisión de Crecimiento para Puerto Rico del Centro para una Nueva Economía. En medio del panorama de ajuste fiscal, la Comisión de Crecimiento para Puerto Rico del CNE es una de las iniciativas más importantes que tiene la isla para redefinir su futuro económico. El año pasado, en medio de la discusión en torno al problema de la deuda y la crisis fiscal, CNE abogó para que el gobierno federal creara una entidad permanente que se enfocara en la recuperación económica de Puerto Rico. Ni el Congreso ni Casa Blanca lo hicieron en ese momento. En vista de que la falta de crecimiento económico es el asunto más urgente que enfrenta Puerto Rico en este momento, en CNE decidimos asumir el liderato y convocamos a un grupo de primer orden, trabajando todos voluntariamente y pro bono, incluyendo al profesor Stiglitz, para comenzar a delinear una nueva estrategia de desarrollo. Por demasiado tiempo, Puerto Rico se ha satisfecho con sobrevivir de salvavidas a salvavidas, sin tener nunca un verdadero plan económico. La discusión sobre el largo plazo siempre ha sido opacada por la emergencia de turno. Nos hemos complacido con esquemas que producen rentas temporeras, pero que no constituyen una estrategia abarcadora o duradera. Nunca parecemos encontrar el momento o los recursos para detener ese círculo vicioso y emprender la ruta hacia la estabilidad y la sustentabilidad económica. En fin, nos hemos desenvuelto en constante reacción a la crisis del momento, sin detenernos a pensar con detenimiento y construir con esmero un plan integral y a largo plazo. La Comisión de Crecimiento para Puerto Rico del CNE tiene como una de sus principales metas romper ese patrón. En vez de reaccionar a la crisis del momento, la Comisión diseñará y ayudará a implementar una política de desarrollo económico balanceada, equitativa y duradera, basada en nuestras ventajas comparativas, que propicien un ecosistema donde cualquier emprendedor pueda impulsar una empresa eficientemente, que genere oportunidades para amplios sectores de nuestra población y que se sostenga mediante motores locales, pero con horizontes globales. No quiero concluir sin agradecer a los visionarios que nos ayudaron a democratizar el conocimiento y difundir este mensaje ampliamente hoy, a Espacios Abiertos, a la Fundación Miranda y a la Fundación Carvajal, nuestro más sincero agradecimiento. Han puesto en acción sus palabras y por eso se han ganado el respeto y admiración del país. Ahora les quiero presentar al profesor Joseph Stiglitz, Premio Nobel de Economía, profesor de Columbia University en Nueva York, reconocido autor e intelectual público global, ex economista en jefe del Banco Mundial, integrante de la Comisión de Crecimiento del Centro para una Nueva Economía y gran amigo de Puerto Rico. Los dejo con el profesor Stiglitz.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you about obviously something that's very important to you, but I think the implications go well beyond Puerto Rico. I'm going to talk about this primarily from a macroeconomic point of view. About what I'm going to focus on is the relationship between Puerto Rico's debt crisis, its depression, and the prospects of returning to economic growth. Maybe I should get clear what my view is from the very beginning. I think the proposals that have been put forward are likely to make the depression in which Puerto Rico has been continue. And I've seen policies like this in other countries around the world, and they have almost never worked. In fact, I can't think of a single example where it's worked. So I think it's important to be aware of the serious consequences of the policies that have been proposed for Puerto Rico. I use the word depression deliberately. We don't like to use the word depression because it's depressing. It's depressing to realize that you're in an economic situation where the economy is not functioning well. The last time the United States as a whole had a depression was the Great Depression in 1929. And when we went into the 2008 recession, we didn't want to use the word depression. We said a deep recession because it was too depressing to use any other word. When I was chief economist of the World Bank, and East Asia was really sinking into a depression, unemployment in the main island of Indonesia, Java, had gone up to over 40%. And you had to say it was a depression. The US Treasury, the IMF, got so upset at the World Bank using the word depression that we had to say they were going through a D. Not a depression, but we say this has gone from a R to a D, from a recession to a depression, so we couldn't use the word. But let me use the word. That's where you are. And the only question is whether the current policies will revive the economy, get it out of a depression into, say, at least mild economic growth, or whether they will lead to a protracted depression. And unfortunately, the policies that have been put forward, I believe, will, in fact, lead to another lost decade for Puerto Rico. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the causes of the current travails for Puerto Rico, but it's worth spending a little time to understand how Puerto Rico got in this situation. It's important to recall that it was actually in a recession or depression even before the global financial crisis of 2008. But like everywhere, the 2008 crisis worsened whatever the state the economy was in. It was a shock. It was a shock that was felt all around the world. Now, the consequences of that shock in some parts of the world have been long-living. I've been writing a great deal about the consequences in Europe. My most recent book is called The Euro, and it explains why it is that Europe is being so slow to recover, why countries like Greece are in a depression. And I don't know if it makes you feel good. Misery sometimes loves company. But unemployment in Greece still is around 25%. Youth unemployment is well over 50%. And after the last IMF program, Troika program in August of 2015, which was supposed to get the economy growing again, the economy just continued to decline. And it's an interesting point that I'll come back to. The debt GDP ratio, the debt sustainability, after all this austerity, after all this pain, the debt GDP ratio is higher than it was in 2010 when the crisis broke out. So, and that's after a debt restructuring. After the creditors had to give up, but they did too little, too late, and they imposed these austerity policies. And the result is enormous suffering in Greece, but the economy is still in depression. So that's, to me, a good example of a failed policy, but it's very similar in many ways to the kind of failed policies that are proposed to be imposed on Puerto Rico. When you look at Europe, there are some other lessons as well, lessons about the consequences of the challenges, if you want to use a euphemism, of countries sharing a common currency, and Puerto Rico shares a common currency with the mainland, the dollar. One of the historically well-performing countries in Europe is Finland. It has high education, high level of equality. You know, they really did everything right, except for one thing. They joined the euro. And that tied their hands. And then, beginning a couple years ago, they had a series of shocks. They had a lot of trade with Russia, and Russia went into a recession, and Russia is an oil country. I won't tell you all the other bad things about Russia. There are lots of bad things. One of the reasons why we should feel nervous about getting too cozy with Russia. But the fact is that their economy went into recession, and since it was a major trading partner with Finland, that had an effect on Finland. One of Finland's main exports are natural resources, and some of those prices went down. That hurt Finland. The result of that is that even though no one says Finland is a mismanaged economy, no one says it's lazy, they're hardworking, no one says anything negative about the institutional structure of Finland, Finland is in a recession, a deep recession. It has not recovered. They've done everything right, as I said, except joining the euro. And the single currency imposes constraints that make it extraordinarily difficult to adjust to these kinds of shocks. The problem in the euro is similar in some ways to the problem here in Puerto Rico. And that is when you have economic integration that is a halfway house. It's not full economic integration like we have within the 50 states of the United States. In Europe, it was a monetary integration with no fiscal integration, no banking union, no common unemployment insurance. So it was a halfway house, but they had free migration of people, free migration of capital. The important lesson is that these halfway houses don't work very well. And one of the points of my book, The Euro, is that you either have to have more Europe or less Europe. And in a way, Puerto Rico is trapped in the same halfway house. And you either have to make a decision of more or less, more integration or less integration. Just to give you an example in the context of Finland and the context of Europe more generally, let me go back to Greece actually. Greece has a high level of debt, but it's what we call place-based debt. It's debt that's associated with living in Greece. But they allow free migration. So if you are a young, talented Greek person, you can walk away from the debt that was created by your parents and your grandparents. Very easy. You just moved to another country in Europe. And then you're not saddled with this debt. And of course, as that migration occurs, the debt per capita on the remaining people gets larger. So the big flaw when they created the euro was they created a divergent system. In other words, if you had a problem in one country, a well-designed system would enable the country with a problem to be helped by the others, and then the country that has a problem would converge to the others, and you would get convergence. And that was their intent. They always talked about convergence. But they didn't think about the underlying economics. And no matter what your rhetoric is, if you create the wrong institutions and the wrong economic framework, you'll get the opposite of what you intended. So while they intended to have convergence, they created divergence. So as the young Greek people move out of Greece, Greece GDP goes down, the ability of Greece to repay goes down, and if you have a economic policy that says, oh, because your GDP is down, we have to raise taxes, have to another dose of austerity, all that's going to happen is that Greece is going to go down, and then more people are going to move, and you get a disaster. And that is exactly the risk that Puerto Rico is facing today. It's even worse, though, in the case of Puerto Rico, because the U.S. has passed some legislation that applies uniformly to both the mainland and to Greece, and to Puerto Rico, without giving Puerto Rico a choice. You know, it is one of the consequences, you say, of being a colony. You don't get to choose a lot of your legal frameworks and your economic policies. So, for instance, I've been a big advocate for an increase in the minimum wage in the United States. But as an economist, one has to recognize that if you have too high of a minimum wage, it can create economic problems. The United States has too low of a minimum wage. But if that same minimum wage is applied in the United States, in the mainland, and to Puerto Rico, where incomes are 1/4 of what they are in the mainland, you can easily wind up with a minimum wage which is too high for the functioning of the economy. So when you have these kinds of uniform rules where you can't participate and adapt them to your circumstances, there is a risk that they will be inappropriate and therefore undermine the economy. That brings me to the question of what were the shocks that led to the beginning of the recession and depression in Puerto Rico. And there were several. Two of them come to mind. In the last presidential election, there was a lot of discussion about NAFTA, about the idea that our trade negotiators got snookered by the Mexicans. Let me just tell you, I've watched these trade negotiations for decades. Our trade negotiators have never gotten snookered. They often asked for the wrong thing. They were reflecting corporate interest. But it wasn't like we were taken advantage of. It was the fact that too often it was corporate and financial interests that were dictating the structure of these trade negotiations and not somebody that was concerned about how they would affect workers. It is interesting that while everybody agrees that NAFTA needs to be renegotiated, any trade agreement, a fallacy in the trade agreements is that they didn't focus enough on the fact that the world is always going to change, and therefore you're always going to need to change the provisions of a trade agreement. They were static. They were structured as static in a very dynamic world. It was very foolish. And I hope in the future, when we have trade agreements, we'll recognize that they have to be more adaptive to the changing circumstances. And it is interesting that as the administration has talked about the changes that need to be done to NAFTA, they've not come up with anything that would significantly affect the trade deficit with Mexico. And interestingly, we have a surplus with Canada. And so are we suggesting that we snookered Canada? The fact is that it is wrong to look at bilateral trade deficits. But there's a little bit of a digression. The real NAFTA did have an effect on Puerto Rico. Whenever you look at a trade agreement, you have to ask, when you make a free trade between two countries, it can divert trade from other countries. So we call that the trade diversion effect as opposed to the trade creation effect. And so NAFTA did have some trade diversion. It was never discussed. And some of that potential trade diversion was with Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was a relatively low-wage economy that had access to the United States. It was a preferential status, and that preferential status disappeared with NAFTA. Now, interestingly, this is exactly the problem that many of the other Caribbean islands faced when the euro was created, and they had special relationships with the UK as part of the Commonwealth, and when the UK joined the EU, they lost that, and that was one of the factors that has actually hurt many of the other Caribbean islands. And one of the interesting aspects of the discussion, post-Brexit debate, is will the UK then now go back to the world as it was and with the special relationships that it had with the Commonwealth before? So that's one of the shocks that Puerto Rico faced. Another shock was industrial policy. The United States did have a policy that was designed to help Puerto Rico grow, based on, focused on pharmaceuticals. It actually worked. It did help develop the industry, but it was a very badly designed. The dollar cost relative to the benefit was very large. And so it was not unreasonable that an administration trying to look for efficiency would say this is not a good program. But they should have said, okay, let's replace that one with a better one. But that was too difficult. So what they did is they say, we'll get rid of that program and won't replace it. And so you had roughly at the same time two shocks, the NAFTA shock and the change in the industrial policy, and nothing was done to deal with these problems. So these are at least parts of the underlying forces giving rise to the problems today on the island. Given those kinds of shocks, it is not a surprise that Puerto Rico would face a debt crisis. And let me make it clear, it is not that the debt crisis has caused the economic downturn. The causality goes the other way. The economic downturn caused the debt crisis. But the problem is that if you don't adequately resolve the debt crisis perpetuates and deepens the economic downturn. So that while the shock were something quite different from the debt crisis is intimately involved, and the failure to deal adequately with the debt crisis will exacerbate, deepen, prolong the economic crisis. So the question then is, what is the appropriate way to respond? And that's really what I want to focus my remarks on. As one thinks about this issue, the first priority needs to be a recovery of the growth of the island. It's really that simple. If you could recover growth, then of course it's possible to repay. If you don't recover growth, it's not possible to repay. So any reasonable approach should begin with the question, what is the underlying macroeconomics? How do we restore economic growth? What is the problem now in the short run and then in the medium and long term? And then how does debt restructuring fit into that? So you want to begin with the well-being of the economy and the well-being of the people in Puerto Rico, not where the board began. The board began with, how do I squeeze Puerto Rico to get as much money out of Puerto Rico, forgetting about any consequences to the people? So it was really one priority. It was a clear priority, and that was extracting as much money as one could. It was sort of like debt peonage. If they thought by putting everybody in prison that would do a job of getting more money, they would reinstitute debt prisons. But that's the way we dealt with debt in the 19th century. If any of you read Dickens, that was the way they dealt with it. It turned out not to be a very good way of getting money back, because when people were in prison, they couldn't repay. But it did have incentive effects. So the point is, as I look at the board's proposal, it is really putting unambiguous priority one, how much can we squeeze out of the island? And I think that's morally wrong. But not only is it morally wrong, it turns out to be not even in the interest of the creditors. Because by thinking about the creditors too much, they squeeze the island too much, and they won't get as much out. Financial sector are always myopic. They're always short-sighted. And we're getting another example of that kind of short-sightedness in the debt restructuring. But there's one other reason that I'll come to that explains this peculiar behavior. Why are they taking policies that the effect of which will be to actually get less out? And that, well, as I say, I'll come to that in a minute. It has to do with intercreditor fights. So, to understand the debt side, as I say, one has to think about the macro, but one also has to think about the debt. So I want to make a couple preliminary remarks about debt. Debt is a voluntary transaction. Nobody forces, there are some examples. In the case of Greece, it was forced to lend money to Germany during World War II. So that's an example of an involuntary debt as a result of the Nazis squeezing Greece. But that's not the way the current debts have been accumulated in Greece or in Puerto Rico. It's a voluntary transaction between a creditor and a debtor. Because of that, the banks and the financial sector like to focus on the borrower was a bad borrower. They didn't behave well. They made a bad decision. They overborrowed. But as I've watched these kinds of situations all over the world, and they happen over and over and over again, my focus is it's a bad lender. The lenders are in the business of doing this over and over again. That's their business, giving credit. They should know more than the borrower about how much the borrower can repay. That's what they're getting paid for, and they get paid a lot for doing that. But they don't do a very good job. But I think the whole discourse has been to try to blame the borrower, and I think one should focus more on the lender. The second point I want to emphasize is the lenders get well compensated for the risk that they undertake. If there were no risk, what would the interest rate be? It would be the T-bill rate. And you would have to pay, when you borrow, 0.5%. I assure you, if you go to New York today to try to borrow, you won't get a loan at 0.5%. You'll have to pay 9, 10, 11, 12, if you can get money. What is the difference? That difference is the compensation for the risk of not being repaid. Now, it's totally understandable when the circumstance comes where you repayment, they're going to say, this is unreasonable, you should repay us. But they've already got their money ahead of time for bearing that risk. And if you look at the cases like Argentina going bankrupt or other countries, what you see is that the creditors actually, on average, get more than compensated for the risk. So on average, in the cases of these defaults, they've made more money than they have than they would have gotten from buying a T-bill. So the interest rate that they charge up front for the risk is actually greater than the actuarial value of the risk they bear. When a country loses the capacity to repay, it's important for the situation to be addressed rapidly. Otherwise, there will be an extended recession, depression, a waste of economic resources, an enormous amount of suffering. We refer to this as too little, too late. We've written a book about this, and showing typically around the world, there is precisely this problem of too little, too late. Another example of a kind of irrationality, and I'll come to try to explain that in a moment. In the situation where countries can't repay, we say the debt is unsustainable, and the country gets involved in a downward spiral. And that's the situation that Puerto Rico is experiencing today. And let me emphasize, the problem is not a lack of willingness to repay, but a lack of capacity. If the economy's GDP has gone way down and it's borrowed excessively, as in the case of Greece or in the case of Puerto Rico, there's absolutely no way you can repay without no way, period. But even the attempt to force it to repay would causes enormous amounts of suffering and typically is counterproductive. So forcing a country to continue servicing the debt in such circumstances only aggravates matters. It turns downturns into recessions and recessions into depressions. Even creditors will lose, as the size of the pie to be distributed among everyone is smaller. Now, this brings me to, well, what is the source of all, why do people get into the situation? Why don't they deal with it more rationally? And the underlying problem that we tend to forget is that there are enormous intercreditor problems. It's natural to focus about the fight between the debtor, say Puerto Rico or the Greece, and the creditors, as if there was a single group of creditors. But in fact, there are many different creditors. And the fights among the creditors are what typically result in the disastrous outcomes we see. Because there's one group of creditors who think if they can get repaid first, they don't care what happens to the other creditors. And depending on the creditor contract, they may believe that they're senior, they have more priority than the other creditors. And usually credit contracts are ambiguous, and so the law is ambiguous, but they're willing to fight in the hope that they will win and they will get repaid and the others not get repaid. So it's this intercreditor fight which leads to these stalemates and these inefficiencies where everybody suffers. It's sort of legal gridlock. We had that in the 2008 crisis. We could have restructured a lot of the home mortgages much more efficiently and avoided the depth of the downturn. But we had a fight between the primary mortgage and the secondary mortgage. And the secondary mortgage wanted to get repaid first, even if it meant that the primary guy got clobbered more than he otherwise would have. And they had both enough power to result in a gridlock and contributing to a really deep economic downturn in the United States. The creditors are first in line in their belief to get repaid, together with speculative investors such as vulture funds whose business model is based on litigation and who bought distressed debt at a large discount. They have incentives to get a gridlock and to negotiate at the expense of the country as a whole. It's precisely because of these conflicts among the creditors and the conflicts between the debtors and creditors that we have bankruptcy laws. And we realize that negotiations don't solve the problem. Every country has a bankruptcy law. When the East Asia crisis happened, many of the East Asian countries did not have, you might say, good bankruptcy laws. And one of the things that the World Bank and the IMF argued and tried to work with the countries was to develop good bankruptcy laws. Designing good bankruptcy laws is more difficult than is a difficult matter, and I'll have a few remarks to make about that later. But as you know, Puerto Rico could not, as a colony, have its own bankruptcy law suited for Puerto Rico. You were carved out of Chapter 9, which was the bankruptcy law that prevails for public bodies within the United States. But let me emphasize that, the reason that we have various provisions in our bankruptcy law, Chapter 11 is a bankruptcy provision for corporations that allows for a quick restructuring of debt. Why do we have Chapter 11? The reason we have Chapter 11 is that we believe that the continuation of a firm, jobs, employment, growth, is more important than these creditor fights. So judicially, we say, we're not going to let you get into that deadlock. When you have a bankruptcy situation, a court will resolve the equity of these disputes and do it rapidly and in such a way that the company can continue and the jobs can continue, the community won't be devastated by the shutdown. So we recognize that in the case of corporations. Chapter 9 was intended to recognize the same thing in the case of municipalities, but that was not extended to Puerto Rico. Now, your new law, in particular Title III, is supposed to extend that to Puerto Rico. But let me emphasize that Puerto Rico is not like a municipality in the United States. And the mentality that was used in establishing this provision was the wrong economic framework. Because you are basically a country. And there's a difference between Detroit and Puerto Rico. And treating Puerto Rico with the same economic framework that you treat Detroit is economically wrong. It's also politically wrong, but it's also economically wrong. And the consequences, if Detroit goes down for the macroeconomy of the United States, is not very significant. But obviously, the way the debt is dealt with here in Puerto Rico has a major macroeconomic effect on Puerto Rico. And that's what I want to talk about next. So let's talk about what is the macroeconomic situation. Well, Puerto Rico is in a recession, depression, and we call situations like that demand constrained. That is to say, there is capacity to produce that exceeds the demand for the goods and services here in Puerto Rico. That was the basic insight of Keynes, that economies could be trapped in these demand-constrained situations. The only way to get out of a demand-constrained situation is to expand demand, increase aggregate demand. For a country like the United States, that's relatively easy. We borrow at very low interest rates. We have some political problems, but we could borrow and we could spend the money on infrastructure that we would need and that would stimulate the economy. So a government that has access to credit can use it for expansionary policies. But if the perception is that debt is unsustainable, access to credit will be limited and expensive, and borrowing to repay existing debt instead of borrowing for implementing expansionary policies will worsen debt sustainability. Now, what is being proposed here is instead to force the government to run a contractionary fiscal policy, to pay debt interest. But that means less resources for stimulating the economy, and that means the downturn is exacerbated. To put it very simply, contractionary policies are contractionary. Austerity is contractionary. There's no way around that. And you could wish it away, but that's what's going to happen. So that kind of situation calls for debt relief to restore the necessary conditions for implementing policies for economic recovery. So when I say debt relief, what one means is deep debt restructuring. And that means debt forgiveness. Now, sometimes debt restructuring means just postponing paying into the future. Now, there's some cases where that might make sense. A country has discovered a huge oil discovery. It's going to be very wealthy, but doesn't have the money yet. So that's a case where you could say, let's postpone paying it until the oil comes online. But so far, you haven't discovered oil. So that means your economic situation 5 years and 10 years from now is not different from what it is today, except if you impose the austerity measures, you'll be much worse off. So just postponing the debt doesn't solve any problem. The fundamental thing, creditors don't like this, but you have to write off the debt. Now, just as a little aside, Germany finds this idea very distasteful in the case of Greece. And IMF and Europe are in the midst of a very bitter battle because the IMF, according to its rules, say we can't participate in any program where the debt is not sustainable, and the debt is not sustainable today. There needs to be a write-off. And Germany says, we can't countenance a write-off, but we insist that the IMF participates. And the poor Greek people are caught between these two warring parties, where they're asked to sign on an agreement where the two parties aren't agreeing about what the agreement is. Well, sometimes you can come up with creative language, and I think that they may succeed in doing that. In the case of the Greek debt, they're reprofiling the debt. And what reprofiling means that you never repay, but you never forgive. So maybe you can use that imaginative language where you say, we will repay you, but often the next world. So you may want to find linguistic creativity. As I said, these are situations that I described where there's a need for a bankruptcy law, but there is no real bankruptcy law for countries, for Argentina, for Greece, for Puerto Rico. And that has led to disastrous outcomes for these countries around the world, and I've seen many of these of the consequences. The restructurings always are in the form of too little, too late, with extraordinary negative social consequences, long-lasting depressions, unacceptable levels of unemployment, poverty, inequality. In response to that, the UN has been working to create a set of principles for for bankruptcy of countries, for sovereigns. Recognize it's not like a city, it's different. And it actually, almost unanimously, it was about 150 to 6, in September 2015, the UN did adopt a set of principles for sovereign debt restructuring. Among the few countries that voted against it was the United States. And you say, why? Doesn't the United States believe in an international rule of law? Certainly not anymore. But even this was during the... But this was in the Obama administration where they were pretending to believe in a rule of law. And, and you know, I was trying to understand, you know, what was going on. And it was very clear what was going on. The vulture funds had gotten to the administration, lobbied, and there were some people came right out of the, you know, the National Security Council of the Obama administration and began working as lobbyists for the vulture funds. It was that bad. And not surprising, the vulture funds did hire the right lobbyists. It worked for them. It was bad for the world. And the U.S. opposed these principles that were almost unanimously agreed to by the international community. So the international community is continuing to work on creating these principles, and those are the ones that should have been adopted by the U.S. Congress. There is a lot of evidence that most sovereign debt restructurings that are guided by the IMF and that kind of reasoning, and the one that you have is of that ilk, are not providing enough relief. The objective of a good debt restructuring is to enable the country to restore debt sustainability. What do we mean? Begin to grow again. A failed debt restructuring is one where the country goes into another crisis in another 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. What that proves is you didn't solve the problem. Exactly what happened in Greece. 2012, there was a debt restructuring. They should have had it in 2010. They finally got it in 2012. And where is Greece today? The debt GDP ratio is headed for over 200%. So they clearly failed. Well, the evidence is that more than 50% of the debt restructurings since 1970 over the last almost half century were followed by another debt restructuring or a default within 5 years. So that is sort of the record of the IMF debt restructurings, of the austerity-based debt restructurings. And that's the record that you need to be realized that you're confronting. So the experience of sovereign matters for Puerto Rico, this experience I've just described matters for Puerto Rico because Puerto Rico, as I said before, is a country, and as such, the macroeconomic effects are relevant. Unfortunately, as I said, you didn't get the kind of debt restructuring bankruptcy framework that you should have gotten. The problem is you got a board. It could be a good thing, but it could be a bad thing if the board does not base its behavior on principles that are aligned with the development goals of the country and that does not put the economy recovery at the center of its plan. And what I've seen so far is the board's behavior is based on the wrong principles and based on putting creditors very much first. So as one starts thinking about what kind of plan would work, one needs to think about a fiscal plan, but first one has to have an economic plan. It needs an economic plan for recovery. But of course, the debt restructuring is part of that. There can't be any economic recovery without recovery of debt sustainability, and there is no recovery of debt sustainability without an appropriate debt restructuring. So these are intimately tied together, and you have to solve them simultaneously. And analytically, I'll come back to that. It's not easy. But the economics of the program are actually simple. The kind of program that always is put forward is that there's a change in government expenditure, there's a change in taxes. Remember, Puerto Rico is in a recession, and that means what is constraining output is aggregate demand. And so if we know what the change in government expenditure is and we know the change in taxes, we can calculate the resulting change in national output. And we can check to see whether it all adds up. And the standard way in which this is done is to use multipliers. That is to say, if you change government expenditure, you reduce government expenditure, that reduces aggregate demand, and the reduction in aggregate demand, the reduction in national output is always going to be a multiple of that reduction. And the argument is very simple. If government spends less money, then people have less money in their pockets. They can spend less money on the goods produced. Those people have lower income, so they spend less money, and the system keeps revolving, and the whole economy shrinks. And we know if you reduce government expenditures by $1, we can calculate how much GDP goes down. Well, if Greece shows what happens to debt sustainability if you don't think through the consequences carefully. When you talk about debt sustainability as the ratio of debt over income, national income. And typically, those focusing on austerity, the Troika, the IMF, focus on the numerator, the debt. They say if we can only get the debt down, the debt-GDP ratio will go down. But what they forget is, if they have the wrong policies, GDP goes down. The denominator goes down. And if the denominator goes down, the debt-GDP ratio goes up. And that's precisely what has happened in Greece. So GDP went down by 25%. It's one of the biggest depressions in record. And it was a man-made depression. It wasn't like there was a war or anything like that. It was caused by the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission with the austerity policies that they imposed on Greece. It was a deliberate policy decision that caused a contraction of 25% in GDP. Well, what has been proposed for Puerto Rico is actually something that is more draconian than Greece. I have never seen a proposal as draconian as the one that has been proposed here. I don't think it will be politically acceptable. I mean, it shouldn't be politically acceptable. It will cause an enormous amount of distress. The original board proposal, calmly, as if it mattered nothing, discussed the impact of their program as resulting in a reduction in GDP in 1 year, of almost 17%. I have never seen anything like that. You know, Greece, it took them 3 or 4 years to get 25%. But you're succeeding in doing 17% in 1 year. And then the government came back with its own program. And you look at the numbers, and they don't add up. You look at the numbers and you say, well, okay, they changed this part from the board proposal, and they changed that part. And miraculously, with these very little changes, GDP contraction is, instead of 17%, just under 6%. Now, you know, I wish I had a magic wand that could be able to do things like that. But there has been no explanation of how those numbers got arrived at. And let me say, looking at the numbers of the original board proposal, they were reasonable estimates based on their cuts. It was not a reasonable policy. It was not a humane, it was not a good economic policy. But the estimates were honest and were a reasonable estimate. But what is talked about in the government proposal is not a reasonable estimate. My colleagues cannot figure out where it came from. Let me try to talk about some of the difficulties and sources of errors of why making these estimates is difficult. And let me just remind you, the IMF, the Troika, the ECB, consistently in Europe underestimated the magnitude of the effects of their program. And that's been almost, all these programs are based on wishful thinking. What they want is the creditors to be repaid. And they really don't want the country to suffer. But of the two, we know which one is more important. So what they try to do is to give a rosy scenario saying, okay, we're going to do this, which is draconian, and we're going to get all these benefits. But in fact, what's going to happen is a marked economic downturn, and when there's that marked economic downturn, the amount of money that they have left over to pay the service of the debt, to repay, will not be what they thought. And that's the sense in which it's counterproductive. They don't even get what they want because of the shrinkage of the economy. So what are some of the reasons why they have been so bad at making the estimates? And it was, if you look at the Greek estimates, the IMF was off year after year after year. I sometimes tease them and say, if my students turned in that kind of forecast 3 years in a row, they would have been failed. But, they're not my students. So, so what are some of the reasons? Well, the first thing is something we have to recognize. The good news is we don't have deep recessions like Puerto Rico or Greece very often. So we don't really have a good data set. So if you estimate multipliers based on an economy that's mostly at full employment, you're going to get the wrong numbers. We know from the experiences that we had after the 2008 crisis, where we've done, a lot of research has been done to try to estimate multipliers, that when you have a deep economic downturn, the multipliers are much, much larger. My understanding is that they've used some multipliers from U.S. regions in recessions. So they did try to use recessions. So not deep recessions like that of Puerto Rico. When you're in a deep recession and depression, multipliers get even larger. And when it's a prolonged deep recession, they get even larger. And so using multipliers for a region is like that is in a recession compared to Puerto Rico that's in a prolonged deep depression will be underestimating the magnitude. But secondly, as I've said many times, Puerto Rico is not really a region of the United States. It's a country of its own. And that means non-traded goods play a more important role. That means that what we call technically leakages are smaller, feedback mechanisms are larger, and that means the impacts are larger. Secondly, and so when one of the crucial determinants of the magnitude of the multipliers is the relative side of the non-traded sector, which is very large in Puerto Rico. A second thing that typically has been misestimated is the importance of the financial sector. And when you have a deep, prolonged economic downturn, domestic firms can't repay their loans. There is a large fraction of mortgages, home mortgages, that are underwater in Puerto Rico. The accounting doesn't reflect that, but the banks may know that. And when you have houses underwater, mortgages exceeding the value of the house, repayments are going to be lower, and the banking system is going to get weaker. Banking is local, and when local banks aren't in good shape, lending gets contracted, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises, which are the core of the economy here, and therefore the feedbacks get larger. And again, that's what's happened in Greece, Italy, Spain, one of the reasons why their downturns were so great. And finally, migration. The population can easily move, and when population moves, the GDP goes down, and that was the divergent effect that I described earlier. So the bottom line is that there are numerous reasons to believe that the downturn will be much larger, even larger than the 17% that the board originally proposed. Inevitably, there are huge uncertainties, and the question that one needs to ask is, how are the board and the government planning to react if the underlying assumptions of the fiscal plan turn out to be incorrect, if the downturn is greater and therefore the amounts of money that are available to repay are much less? A good plan has to foresee the contingent reactions to a reality that differs from the plan's underlying assumptions. And this, I think, is a very important thing to bear in mind. Now, finally, it's not just the amount of restructuring. When I said there has to be real debt write-downs, but it's also the broader way in which the restructuring matters. As I said, the country needs debt relief. In fact, the size of the necessary relief depends on other conditions of the restructuring. In the short term, a distressed country has no capacity not only to repay, but also to stimulate. Because it can't repay, that's why a moratorium is necessary. But more than a moratorium is needed. A plan for recovery needs expansionary macroeconomic policies, which in turn require credit or money from some source. It would be good if the federal government provided assistance, but I wouldn't hold my breath. But in the absence of that, you need fresh credit. And this is particularly, Puerto Rico is a real instance of this, but this happens in corporations as well. And that's why sensible restructuring plans include a condition called lending into arrears that makes new debts senior to the old debts. So you can get new money at a reasonable interest rate, not at 9, 10%, but because it's senior to all others. And then you can use that money to stimulate the economy. The effects of the restructuring also depend on how the losses are distributed. Restructurings are more successful when the share of domestic restructured debt is lower, as domestic bondholders are more likely to have larger marginal propensities to consume in the domestic economy than foreign borrowers. In other words, the macroeconomic effects here in Puerto Rico are likely to be larger. So this is, there's a broad analytic challenge that one of my postdocs, Martin Guzman, has been working on and done a brilliant job in analyzing. You have to solve simultaneously for a good debt restructuring plan and a fiscal plan, and taking into account how both of them together affect economic performance. But let me emphasize that restructuring is not the end of the story. Only when defaults arise as a consequence of things like accidents, like external shocks, natural disasters, will a restructuring be sufficient. Otherwise, we have to start analyzing what was the original source of the problem. The distressed economies need to transit to more dynamic structures of production, or else they have to adjust to permanently lower standards of living. And now this brings me to what has gotten some attention in the programs, and those are sometimes called supply-side reforms. They should be a part of a long-term plan, but the timing and the form of the reforms matter. What I argued before was that in a depression, and Puerto Rico is in a depression, a country needs to foster aggregate demand. Any supply-side reform that in the short term decreases aggregate demand is, as a result, counterproductive, as it worsens the depression, and it ends up discouraging rather than encouraging investments. And most of the proposed supply-side reforms fall into that category. They are simultaneously depressing demand, and the immediate effect will be a worsening of the economic downturn. And this is, again, a problem that I've seen over and over again. It's a problem in the supply-side reforms in Europe. Well, that brings us to the broader questions. One needs to have a growth strategy, think about the long run. But in the budget, there are many things that affect the real long-term prospects of the country. So if you cut education spending, university spending, you are threatening the long-term growth of the economy. A 21st century economy has to be based on learning. One of my other recent books is called Creating a Learning Society. And the point is that, we're not making simple pings like Adam Smith talked about. We went from agriculture to manufacturing, but we're going now from manufacturing to a knowledge economy. Manufacturing is only 8%, 9% of employment in the United States. Much more important are those jobs related to knowledge. And if you don't have the skills, you're going to be left behind. And that's the Rust Belt workers that we have in the United States. And what's happening to those Rust Belt workers, those people without a college degree, has been absolutely devastating. Ann Case and Angus Deaton got the Nobel Prize in 2015, have been looking at the data on what happens to, say, white males without a college education. And the picture has been disastrous. Life expectancy has been going down in the United States, while life expectancy everywhere else in the world is going up. And it's from social diseases. Social diseases like alcoholism, suicide, drug overdose. Why? Because there are no economic prospects. And without any economic prospects, people get depressed. And what you are seeing in the United States is the consequences of the failure to give educational opportunity for all. So it is, in that sense, worsening the most serious problem that I believe America as a nation faces, which is the problem of inequality, but it also has a direct effect on our economic growth. If you don't have well-educated people, you won't be able to grow. So, I should make one more comment, which is the model of education that the United States has had, which is high tuition, making students borrow, and get in debt is broken. The student debt now in the United States is over $1.2 trillion. It's more than any debt other than home mortgages. It is having macroeconomic effects. And for people who do not have well-off parents, that debt is beyond their willingness to accept. And they face, I've seen this and it's heartbreaking, so many young people say, you know, I know that if I don't get an education, I'm condemned. But if I do and I borrow, I'm condemned. And their choice, they feel like they have no choices. And that is not a good situation. And it's very interesting. I had breakfast yesterday with the First Minister of Scotland, and Scotland has tried a very different course. They've said that they want to grow their economy. They were a manufacturing economy, and they've had to make the transition. And they say the only way that we are going to succeed in making sure that we have shared prosperity, real growth, is to give free education to everybody. So they've gone. So they've gone for a zero tuition policy. It's interesting also, compared to UK, to England, they've said that they've wanted to say that anybody in Europe can come there and get a free education if they stay. So rather than closing their borders and putting people outside, they say we want to be an open international economy. We want to get the best talents from everywhere. And they say we think that that's a growth strategy. So it's very interesting. They've also said that we have to have strong industrial policies, for instance, promoting green innovation. And so they're trying to think more broadly how they can use that talent to promote the growth their economy. So the big questions that Puerto Rico will need to face are: what kinds of instruments does it have to transform its structure of production? What changes in the legal framework can be implemented to give the country the necessary advantages for the developing new sectors? What other potential new dynamic sectors? These are key issues that the local authorities, the businesses, the academic community will need to think about. But this is important. The debt restructuring is a precondition for any growth strategy. You can't grow if you are in this midst of this debt depression. And there has to be deep restructuring. The CNE created a growth commission in which I serve, and it's been focusing on understanding how do we go about creating these dynamic forces moving forward, and what kinds of macroeconomic frameworks are necessary in order for those structural reforms to actually work. And we'll be meeting tomorrow to discuss these issues more extensively. So let me conclude. One more remark before I conclude. The disastrous nature of the kind of program that have been put forward can be seen if you look at the real GDP in 26, where real GDP means GDP adjusted for inflation. And it's still something like 10% below the level that Puerto Rico had in 2016, which of course is below where it was before the beginning of the Depression. So this is not an economic strategy that provides the basis for a reasonable discussion of growth going forward. It should be viewed as, this is not, it should not be viewed as the beginning of a framework. I think there needs to be a totally different framework, one that does provide for a deep enough, quick enough debt restructuring that enables Puerto Rico to return to real economic growth. So let me conclude. Generally, those who suffer most in any crisis are those who played no role in creating it. It's always the most vulnerable. The chances of a successful resolution are larger when the different actors of the society, civil society, academic community, business community, press, and especially the government, are aware of the implications of following different paths, policies. I hope my talk helps to deepen your understanding of the relevant economic mechanisms that will be at play and the consequences that different policies would have for the economic and social development of your country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Stiglitz, for that wonderful public lecture. We have not as much time as we had hoped, but we still want to ask a few of the questions that the audience has written down during your talk, and I want to bring a few of them to you right now. Actually, before I get to these, one that I'll ask myself is, in the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of talk about Puerto Rico's need to foster aggregate demand, as you mentioned, but a lot of criticisms also in terms of saying, well, you know, Puerto Rico is too poor to do that. We don't have the money to do that. How can you be against austerity when we don't really have the resources to foster that aggregate demand? How would you answer that?
Well, as I said, the whole thrust is that if you have a deep restructuring, you have more resources, and that forcing Puerto Rico to pay the debts is taking away money that could be used to stimulate the economy. And the second point is this provision that I talked about, lending in arrears, is a way of getting some credit, not a lot. You won't be able to, that will help you pump prime your economy to get it going again. So there are some things you can do within your constraints. It is right you have constraints, but what the plans have put is repaying the creditors above the well-being of the island, and that's what I think is what I've been emphasizing.
There's a question here. It says, is there any measure or policy adopted by the government or the people of Greece that Puerto Rico can adopt or that we should avoid?
Well, I think Greece has lots of lessons for what to avoid. I mean, looking at Greece, you have to say it didn't work. And what happened was that they talked loud, but after saying we won't accept austerity, we won't accept it, in the end, they did. And that was the critical mistake. Now, it was even worse than that because the lenders, the creditors, were not nice people. And they said that because you criticized us, we're going to be even tougher. So rather, they actually increased the degree of austerity because of the tough talk. They said, we can't trust you anymore. And so, the fights have been going on. So I think that the lesson of Greece is that you have to not only talk about fighting austerity, you actually have to do it. What form that takes, I don't know, but it will take political, civic action to make sure that these kinds of austerity measures are not adopted.
This is a question from Baldwin School. The students at Baldwin School ask, you mentioned that in order to minimize debt of the island, it should be restructured. Given that some of that money is owed to local bondholders who live on the island and contribute to the local economy, wouldn't this have an adverse effect on the island?
Yeah, that I mentioned very briefly that in that issue in my talk, and that's something that has to be addressed. When Argentina went through its debt restructuring, it was addressed. It's been a big issue in the case of Italy, where one of their banks many of their banks are actually in deep trouble and worried that a debt restructuring, many of the people who are the creditors are ordinary Italians. So the way, at least, that the EU is arguing that it should be done, and I think it makes some sense, is to say, go through the debt restructuring, but as part of the program. And as I said, you can't separate out the debt restructuring from the macroeconomic and the growth program. You have to look at all three of these pieces together. What you say is that for the banks, or for the credit unions that, for instance, took on government debt as a result of pressure, Puerto Rican government debt as a result of pressure, you will recapitalize them, so that it is imperative to make sure that local financial institutions are able to provide credit to businesses and individuals in Puerto Rico. So you have to maintain that. And for individuals, it may be that you have a special provision that allows for tax loss provisions in the income tax that basically lets absorption by society as a whole of a significant fraction of the losses that they bear. So it is a question you have to deal with, but it is a matter, no way that you can deal with it perfectly, but there are ways of at least mitigating the adverse effects.
And the last question, given that Puerto Rico has a dependency on foreign corporate investment, but has not supported small and medium-sized firms on a local level, what industrial policy do you recommend to strengthen the local economy?
Well, that's where I do think one aspect of that is obviously making sure that you have financial institutions that are local, that are focused on local lending. One of the reasons that the recovery in the United States was so slow was that in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, while we saved the big banks like Goldman Sachs, we let literally hundreds of local banks go bankrupt. And even those that didn't get bankrupt were constrained, were weaker. And that meant that years after the crisis, lending to SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, was very constrained. So what I had argued, what you should have done, was to have much more focus on making sure that the financial institutions that serve small and medium-sized enterprises are supported, and that, in fact, within U.S. banks, we have something called CRA, Community Reinvestment Act provisions, which require banks to lend to underserved communities. I've argued that we ought to extend that to say they have an obligation to serve, to provide a certain fraction of their resources to SMEs. We also have in the mainland, SBA, the Small Business Administration, that provides partial guarantees for small businesses. And some of these have been extraordinarily successful, like Federal Express began as a small business loan and would not have started. A huge industry was started as a result of that kind of government guarantee. So that's another part. Now, so that's one part. But I think another part are real support for certain areas of research and trying to identify areas, clusters, where you can build off existing strengths and where mild government support can actually make a difference. From the experience that Puerto Rico had with the pharmaceuticals, it did succeed in helping develop an industry. Cuba has succeeded in helping develop, again, a few industries through industrial policy based on a learning economy, based on recognizing the strength that they have, in their case, in the health sector. So what I want to say is that it's difficult, and it's what we're going to be discussing at our Growth Commission meeting tomorrow, but there are a whole variety of actions that government can do to create not only a better environment for SMEs, but actually an environment that is supportive in the sense of giving them some of the little assistance that will push them over the top and actually create a more vibrant economy here in Puerto Rico.
Well, thank you very much. We're out of time, but we appreciate it. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Buenas tardes.
Okay. I'll talk a little too long.